Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to this webinar, which is part of the eForum Series 2025 on the role of digital technologies in the management of epilepsy. I'm Helen Cross, and I'm moderating this session. I'm a paediatric neurologist in London and the immediate past president of the International League Against Epilepsy. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our speakers, Colin Josephson from Canada, Jacqueline French from the USA, and Arjune Sen from the United Kingdom. As we go forward, we have 3 talks. These will go consecutively, and at the end of the hour, we will have a further 30 minutes for questions and answers. And what I suggest is that you put your questions as we go along in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen so that we are able to address these at the end of the hour period. The webinar will be recorded and available to those on demand for those who have registered. And as with previous eFora, beforehand you had a list of pre-reading. And tomorrow morning you will receive a link to a case from our academy and indeed some further post-reading. We do wish to acknowledge the support of the 2025 eForum series from our silver supporters, UCB, and bronze supporters, Jazz Pharmaceuticals. As I've indicated, please can you type your questions into the Q&A box so we can address them to all the panelists. And in addition to getting the case tomorrow, you will also be asked to complete a short survey at the end of the eForum to give us feedback about what we should be doing in the future. These are the conflicts of interest of the panelists. So it's with no further ado that I introduce our first speaker, Colin Josephson, who's Associate Professor of Neurology and Community Health Sciences in Calgary, Canada, and the immediate past chair of the Big Data Commission of the International League Against Epilepsy. And he is going to speak or introduce the topic with regards to equitable, effective, and ethical artificial intelligence in epilepsy. Thank you, Colin.
All right, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. And what I would like to do is start exactly as you said, is starting the eForum by providing a general introduction into AI and review some of the work that we have done as part of the Global Advocacy Council. So let's see here. Trying to move this slide ahead. There we go. So we can conceptualize artificial intelligence as the science and engineering of building intelligent machines and algorithms that are in systems that are capable of performing tasks that typically require human intelligence. So as an example, as I have down here in the screen, as you can see in the lower corner here, oops, sorry, it's a bit finicky here. This is an example of a subtype of artificial intelligence called machine learning. So what it essentially does is, in this example, it would take cats, it would learn the specific features or characteristics that describe what a cat looked like. And then what it can next do is take an example of images with cats and dogs, and hopefully with a high degree of accuracy, by using the features that it learned, it can start to then distinguish cats from what it would call not cats. So this is a binary problem. You're either a cat or you're a not cat. And the idea here would be that hopefully with a high degree of accuracy, that can be applied to other problems in the future. But again, this seems very simple. It's fairly easy for our organic neural networks or our brains to make that distinction between a cat and a not cat. But it's actually somewhat difficult, if you think about it, trying to describe to a computer or to an artificial intelligence how our brain intuitively makes those decisions. As an example, I can give you my cat here, Nigel. She's an exotic short-haired cat, so she's brachycephalic. She has a bit of a squat head that's short and wide. So morphologically, actually quite different than what we would see from a random cat, as you can see here. Likewise, here are my dogs down here at the bottom, Pancakes, Marge, and Ethel. Again, all morphologically very different from each other, but our brain can easily understand that these are all dogs despite their differences. Now, trying to explain this might be difficult. You could say here that Nigel's snout is actually maybe somewhat similar to Pancake's, or her ears share similar characteristics to Ethel's here. And so at the end of the day, as I mentioned, this appears to be a superficially easy problem, but it's actually difficult to implement and operationalize within a computer environment. So this is probably why it has taken so long for us to reap the benefits of AI. Part of it is that dangerous combination of what seems to be a simplistic problem and perhaps hyperbolic expectations about the impact it would have on society. Because we know that the term AI was coined in around 1956. The concept of AI existed well before then, but we're only now starting to reap those benefits of AI. And we've actually gone through multiple winters. Some of this is down to inflated hype. As we mentioned before, the problems seem very easy, but they're actually very difficult to implement and to operationalize. But there's been some other issues as well. So developing those computer systems that are able to parse that data to create the predictions that we need accurately to perform optimal tasks within medicine. Part of that was due to some friction between what we call symbolic and sub-symbolic AI. So we can conceptualize symbolic AI in the parlance of computer science as essentially symbolic, meaning human readable approaches to representations of problems, logic, and search. So in other words, if you have a large enough knowledge and you have human input as to how that knowledge relates to each other, you can create an inference engine, such as a if, then, else arrangement to try to come up with a quick answer. So you could create potentially decision trees, like saying if the animal has whiskers and its pupils look like lenses, then cat, else not cat. So you could have very complex decision trees that a computer can parse through very quickly based on expert knowledge and provide an answer. As opposed to this, you could have what we call sub-symbolic AI. So as you would expect, this works below the level of human readable symbols. So in other words, it works on raw data. So here you can imagine you take the image of the cat, you take the pixels or extract the pixels from that image, run the pixels through a network. This network activates different nodes within that network based on the pixel intensity, alignment, and arrangement. Then ultimately the image activates that network in a specific way. So perhaps the pixels that define the whiskers or the slit-like pupil creates a pattern of activation that we could statistically analyze, and it might be specific to cats. So we can say if that network activation is present, it's a cat. If not, it's a not cat. So again, this held much promise, but it is, as you can imagine, very difficult to implement something like this. But at the end of the second AI winter, in the early to late 1990s, we began to have a benefit of two approaches. One is we are finally developing computational power that will allow us to actually quickly run refinements of a model like this. And in fact, as you can see here, by 2010, we've had an exponential increase in computational power so that a single training run, for instance, from Gemini Ultra can run up to 100 septillion calculations to train a model, which is impressive. That's more stars than there are in the sky at this point. And also we have significant tranches of data that we can then analyze that we never had before. So that combination of computational power and data allows us to run these models quicker and more succinctly. As well, we've developed techniques that can combine the benefits of both approaches, so what we call a neurosymbolic approach that combines both symbolic and sub-symbolic AI to enhance their performance. So now we can start to explain why this is finally seeing our explosive growth. We have the computation, we have the data, and we now have refined approaches that can accurately make those distinctions. So epilepsy is an excellent example of this. And what I would like to highlight is the SCORE AI that I think many people are aware of. It really benefited from all aspects that we just described. Its development data set contained over 30,000 EEGs that were annotated from 2 centers. So now we have sufficient data. It also benefited from a very complex sub-symbolic model called a convolutional neural network. And so what we could do is apply that convolutional neural network to these EEGs to start to predict outcomes, such as whether that EEG is normal or whether it has a specific abnormality. We also benefited from having almost 10,000 holdout sets that it could then be tested on to ensure its training performance is equal when it sees EEGs that it has never seen before during its training. And when you evaluate it within this testing set, you can see it actually works very well on EEGs it's never seen before. So if you have a group of EEGs where about 20% of them were normal, again, the model's average predicted probability of a normal EEG within that set is equal, about 20%. If you have about 40% EEGs that are normal and you run a model on that, the average predicted output is about 40% normal. And again, here, 60. So this is really well calibrated. As well, we could look at how well it discriminates between a normal and an abnormal EEG, for instance. So this is the AUC, so it looks at an individual level discrimination between how well it discriminates between normal and abnormal. You could think of the AUC as a measure that ranges between 0 and 1. So that's the probability that it gives a normal EEG a higher score than an abnormal EEG, if that's what it's intending to do. So 0.5 is 50%. That would mean a 50% chance that would give a normal EEG a higher score than an abnormal one, if that's what it was intending to do. 50% is, of course, random chance. So you definitely want to be above the 50% line. So you can see here, for most of these aspects, that model performed quite well. So identifying normal recordings, epileptiform abnormalities, and non-epileptiform abnormalities, it was between about 0.9 to 1. So it is performing quite well in terms of its ability to do that. And that is likely because of some of the benefits that we've seen. So as a result of that, we can see that we are exponentially increasing more data. Models are becoming more sophisticated. And so we do now have the capacity to see where epilepsy is going to influence AI in the future. This is primarily in the form of decision support tools. We are already seeing nomograms being created, machine learning algorithms, deep learning, large language models that can all be used for this to help us make decisions at the point of care for a person with epilepsy that's directly in front of us. We are already seeing devices that allow for seizure detection, devices or algorithms that allow for lesion detection on neuroimaging, as well as wearable devices that patients can use to detect seizures as well. And ultimately, what we're also moving towards is this concept of a digital brain twin, in essence. So we can take a person's imaging, we can take their EEG, and we can create essentially a digital representation of their own personal brain. And by manipulating that digital representation, that might help us provide better diagnostic care. And by simulating what a surgery could do to that brain, we might be able to also improve outcomes from a surgical perspective. So we can almost do surgery in advance of the actual surgery on that patient within a virtual environment to improve our ability to prognosticate how that person will do. So the future is very exciting, but it is not without risk. So we cannot go blindly into the future. We need to understand what potential limitations there can be in these models. So specifically from an epidemiological perspective, which is my base training, we think of bias as a systematic or non-random error in study design or conduct that can result in erroneous results. This will typically either artificially inflate or dilute the predictive capacity of that model. So we'll either overestimate or underestimate its ability to perform. In particular, we want to avoid what is called impermissible discriminatory bias. So in other words, this consists of the model resulting in disparate treatment or disparate impact on particular individuals based on a protected characteristic. So it might work better in certain groups with different ethnicities or different socioeconomic backgrounds. And of course, that is something that we absolutely have to avoid moving forward. So again, we need to start moving forward when we're moving forward using what are called fairness metrics. So beyond just simply looking at its ability to discriminate and its calibration, we should also look at its ability to ensure that it performs equally well in different groups and different equity-based groups. And there are multiple different metrics, as I've listed here, that probably do need to be deployed in the future to ensure equal accuracy across all populations. I'll give you an example of how that could work here. So this is an example of what we would call algorithmic bias. Really, you can conceptualize use of AI into two nodes. One is how well the model works, and then how we use that model in terms of clinical care. For now, I will just focus on how well that model works. So as an example, this group created a pretend model or a fake model that essentially looked at the probability of someone who has committed a crime in the past of committing another crime in the future, so recidivism. So what they did was they pretended they created a model. It was primarily based on where that person lived. And you could say it's working fairly well. So what they said was that if the predicted probability of committing another crime was above 70%, then you can assume that person will commit a crime. So what we saw here was that, and this model, is, as I mentioned, is primarily based on where they live. So people within area 1, as I've highlighted here, 1 out of 4 or 25% committed a crime again. That's fairly close to the predicted probability that we have here of 20% from that model. If we then look at area 2, again, performs fairly well. So again, 3 out of those 4 people committed a crime, 75%, which is fairly close to what the model predicted, about 80%. So again, at the end of the day, you could argue this model looks great. Let's use it to help provide safety within our community. But I think is very obvious from the table that we just displayed, if you do not take into account latent sensitive variables, you can actually result in harm to patient populations. So again, people who are mostly white lived in area 1, as you can see here. Of those who are white, 2 of 4 committed a crime, so about 50%. If you average out their probability of committing a crime, it kind of underestimated that at about 35%. If you were not white, you tended to live in area 2. Again, only 2 of 4 committed a crime again, so 50%. But if you average out this probability here, it actually gave them a probability of about 65%. So now you're going to end up treating these two populations quite differently, and arguably that should not be the case because the model is actually not performing well based on that characteristic. And again, you can see that this is systematic because the probability of committing a crime, if you didn't, when you look at this, was 50%. So overestimate here, lots of false positives compared to if you were white. Conversely, the probability of committing a crime, of not committing a crime, if you committed a crime in the past, was about 50% versus 20%. So again, an overestimate, people who are white were given the benefit of a doubt of not committing another crime, whereas those people who are not white were not given that benefit of the doubt. So there was a systematic expression of the risk in people that were not white, and that was because we did not factor in latent variables in this model. So this goes to show that we need to be very, very sensitive to this, and model constraints and adjustments would be needed to increase the accuracy for non-white people. So again, you can imagine our epilepsy population is very sensitive and is at risk of inequity. So we have to be very careful about how we apply these models to ensure that that is not happening. As well, if we have a perfect model, so we have no sources of bias, there can still be implications about how we roll it out in the real world. So this is a really nice example from the area of ophthalmology. So in the utopic world of Google Mind's laboratory, what they developed was a deep learning algorithm that detected diabetic retinopathy on fundoscopes. And so this had a 97% sensitivity, 93% specificity. It ran in 10 minutes. And they said this would be fantastic for low and middle income countries. It could revolutionize care for diabetic retinopathy there. In fact, unfortunately, it did the complete opposite. So what happened was when it was deployed in Thailand, unfortunately, they do not have research-grade cameras. So this resulted in poor data quality. And the lack of internet access meant that it ran in much longer than 10 minutes. So this, unfortunately, led to a number of problems. To err on the side of caution, the Google group had decided that if the output was poor data quality, then by definition, you should just refer to the ophthalmologist just to be on the safe side. And as well, it took forever for it to finally output poor data quality. So they were taking forever within primary care clinics, and then ophthalmologists were overwhelmed with referrals they likely would not have seen if you had simply looked at the fundograph yourself. So this again shows that even if your model performs exceptionally well without bias, it is integral that we first study it in the real world before rolling it out in the real world, especially in lower and middle income countries that may not have the same capacity as the environment in which they're originally developed. The one other thing that we also need to think about when it comes to AI in terms of routine care is the overall risks on climate. So again, if we develop an algorithm that is accurate, unbiased, and that performs exceptionally well in the real world, we still aren't out of the water yet. Because you can see here, if you train a complicated, what we call a transformer model with a neuroarchitectural structure, you can see a single train of that could produce the amount of carbon equivalent that is equal to almost 5 life years of an American car. That's a single run could produce up to about 5 years of an American car. This is an example here of carbon emissions over about 2021 to 2024 from 79 major AI companies. And as you can see here, that cumulative impact of these blue lines was significant over those 3 years. So by the end of 3 years, about 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent were produced. And if you were to extrapolate that, just taking the 20 worst offenders in terms of carbon emissions, we may end up, it could extrapolate to producing over 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year based on AI models. So again, there has been now calls that this could end up being an environmental disaster as well. So we need to think carefully about how we use this and ensure that we use it in an ethical way from that perspective. So at the ILAE, through the Global Advocacy Council, we have been reviewing our approach to AI and trying to determine how we could create an equitable, ethical, and effective AI paradigm moving forward. So we have therefore conceptualized this into 3 highly interconnected domains: the content domain, the context domain, and the solution domain. So really the content domain involves engagement and knowledge synthesis. So working with all interest holders out there to understand what the priorities are, what the needs are, and what are the lowest hanging fruit that we can identify that could benefit most from AI. They would have to work within the context domain. So this primarily involves policy, education, and culture. These are the laws and regulations that govern consent, stewardship, interoperability, and data entry, as well as internet access, technical structure, and sustainable planning. These two are highly connected and synergistic. If you have a problem and it can be solved in this environment and it is high priority, then we can move down to what we call the solution domain. So this is development and implementation. Now we have the ability to drive, validate, and assess the real world performance of that model, make sure that it undergoes formal approvals and governance, and then we can ensure that it is sustainable so that it undergoes constant improvement over time. The learnings from this domain can therefore be fed back into the engagement and knowledge synthesis of the content domain, as well as the context domain, and you can see where this continues in an iterative fashion. Now, this is a non-exhaustive list, but to do this, we also need to employ what we call decision intelligence. What that means is engaging with all interest holders very early. This forms the basis for the content domain, where we need to be addressing a number of themes. I don't want to go into this in great detail. The idea is we need to start addressing very early in the process the relevance and necessity of a proposed AI solution. Is it relevant and is it needed? Do we have the available data to actually create that model? What degree of interpretability and trust does the clinician and the patient have to have in that final model for it to be effective? What are the regulatory institutional aspects that would allow it to work? What is the communication and the usability in terms of that? So does it have to be very intuitive to all, does it have to be available to all workers or to a select few that understand the technology? We need to make sure we have sufficient infrastructure and resources to run it in that environment. We need to look at the global impact. Is it going to create more inequities? In other words, only be used in high resource areas versus low resource areas? And could it adversely affect climate, as we talked about? We need to make sure it's scalable, sustainable, and we may need to consider whether industry and commercialization needs to be involved at that stage too. So to start on that, we had a great meeting at the African Epilepsy Congress because, as I mentioned, one of the goals here is to make sure that this is beneficial to the entire epilepsy community. So it's working specifically with low and middle income countries. So for this, we provided a pre-conference survey of IBE attendees that involved people with epilepsy or caregivers. That was about 11. And at the conference, we worked with 36 participants, including epilepsy caregivers and people with epilepsy. So we divided them into healthcare providers and people with epilepsy and the caregivers, and we provided standardized sessions to understand what their needs are at this very early stage. We were able to derive some themes that primarily involved trust and consent, access and infrastructure, the benefits and opportunities, challenges and concerns, education and training, and ethics and government. So trust and consent is obviously critical for AI acceptance. Interestingly, Patients believed more in their clinicians than AI. So if the clinicians seemed trustworthy and they believed in the AI, that could be acceptable to patients. We need to make sure that we have the access to technology as well as internet to run it even in rural areas, especially in low and middle income regions. It needs to, but there is still hope that there really was hope amongst everybody that it could revolutionize care. They did have concerns, though, of course, about data quality, black box issues, and potential for further marginalization between rich and poor groups, as well as the need for education about how to use these tools and making sure we have strong governance in place to make sure that people remain safe. So really what we have decided that moving forward are the priority setting really should be designing for equity. We need to build trust amongst all interest holders, and this likely would require using explainable AI as best as possible and always ensuring there is a human within that loop of AI. Tailoring the AI clinically to focus specifically on areas of high need. So whether it's diagnostics, medication guidance, seizure prediction, it is important to work with the interest holders to make sure we are not producing redundant or irrelevant solutions. It is critical that we validate these solutions locally to make sure they work just as well in a new environment as they do in the original environment. And we have to ensure sustainability. So just rolling an AI model out to an area without plans to ensure that it remains there, continues to work and refine within that environment would also, of course, be problematic. So in conclusion, AI will be a part of epilepsy management. We know that. So to ensure that we build ethical, equitable, and effective tools, arguably as part of the Global Advocacy Council, we will be advocating for establishing multi-interest holder governance structures, ensuring coordination, accountability, and ethical oversight, securing equitable access to AI tools by addressing infrastructure and cost, developing strong partnerships with national governments and global organizations to make sure that everyone and all interest holders are a part of this process. We are calling for early and sustained local representation at all stages of AI development to ensure cultural relevance, sustainability, and to reduce the climate impact. And then to also devise metrics to evaluate success beyond just technical performance to ensure that we have the optimal real-world performance and that it works well for all groups, irrespective of their background. So with that, I do have a poll because it is quite interesting to understand, to what degree AI is being used currently within our environment. So interestingly, I know lots of people have probably used generative AI, large language models in epilepsy care, and I'm sure patients have probably been using that for you as well. And then what's interesting, and one of the third poll here is that what did come up at some of these is concerns that could potentially AI make epilepsy specialists redundant moving forward. So with that, I'm very honored to have given this talk today. I would like to thank the panel for the opportunity, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions afterward. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. I think we have some interesting answers. So about 50-50 about using AI. As the patients come to you with questions, I'm quite surprised that actually that is quite low. And I suppose the issue is moving it down. Are we concerned? Thankfully, not many are concerned about it making us redundant, but we can discuss this at the end. So now it gives me great pleasure in introducing Jackie French, who's Professor of Neurology at NYU Langone Health and Medical Director of the Epilepsy Foundation. And what a better person to talk to us about diaries and wearables and how they may move us forward in epilepsy management. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak in this very, I've already learned some things myself in regards to artificial intelligence, and I'm looking forward to an exciting question and answer session at the end. So I was given the task of talking about wearables primarily and how they can move us forward in management. So here are my disclosures. So why do we need wearables in epilepsy? There are a number of reasons. We have to start with the why, and then we'll talk about the how. So the first thing is that patients may not be aware of their own seizures, as we know, and therefore, how can you track something if you're not aware of it? And if you can't track it, how can it be appropriately treated? And even if they are aware of seizures, few people with epilepsy, as I'm going to show you, consistently maintain diaries, and that may make it hard for physicians to know when treatments are working and when they're not. I think that most people think of wearables and their utility in terms of the next bullet, which is that seizures obviously can be dangerous or deadly. And once a seizure has begun, it may be impossible for that individual to call for life-saving assistance. So, to have a device that calls for you obviously would be a benefit. And finally, we're going to talk about parents. And I think parents are driving a lot of wearable use in epilepsy because the potential that they may be unaware of seizures that may be harmful to their children produces an enormous amount of anxiety for them. So we're going to start there with the issue of seizure detection and seizure tracking in children. And as I said, the unpredictability of seizures that can happen anytime, anywhere, during the day, or more importantly, during the night, produces extremely high anxiety in their caretakers who feel responsible for any potential harm that may befall those in their care. And this anxiety is even greater when the child has a developmental and epileptic encephalopathy, which may mean more severe, more frequent seizures, seizures with falls, tonic-clonic seizures, prolonged seizures, and status epilepticus. Whether it is a DEE or not, this often leads to the parent thinking that they can't even leave their child to go to sleep in their own bed. And it can lead to co-sleeping until a very advanced age, and can also lead to parental exhaustion. I will never forget the parent who told me that for the first year of his child with developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, for the first year after the diagnosis was made, he sat every night by the bedside and just watched his son for the entire night and did not sleep because of the anxiety that the child might have a seizure that he didn't know about. And there are also issues for adolescents and adults because if that adolescent or adult lives alone or spends substantial periods of time alone, seizure counting could be difficult or impossible. Particularly nocturnal seizures may be difficult to count. And of course, they would not have someone who could come running if they heard a seizure from the next room, for example. So how do they call out for help? And we know that missed seizures are a very important issue. In a landmark study that was done in the epilepsy monitoring unit, of 582 seizures that occurred, 323 of them were not documented by the patients who were asked to keep a diary during the time they were in the monitoring unit. Interestingly, 68%, not all, but 68% of awake seizures were documented, but only 14% of sleep seizures were documented. And when you looked across, only 38% of people were perfect documenters. So the other people all missed a seizure at one point or another. And of course, some people did push the button for a seizure and the seizure and still did not document that seizure. So they were aware of the seizure in the moment, but they couldn't document it because probably their memory was erased or they forgot to document it later. And you can see here in terms of tonic-clonic seizures, which are, obviously the ones that we have the most urgent need to know about. There were 197 sleep seizures, 48 of those were tonic-clonic seizures, and only 20 of them, and 20 of those tonic-clonic seizures were undocumented by the patient in sleep, which was 41%. So 41% of the time, even a tonic-clonic seizure was missed in sleep. We always tend to think that the person will wake up feeling sore or with a bitten tongue that will indicate to them that a tonic-clonic seizure happened at night, but apparently that almost half the time is not the case. And even if people can track in electronic or paper seizure diaries, they don't do it consistently. So, like we already talked about the fact that they might not be aware of their seizure, and you can't track something you're not aware of. But unfortunately, it's also not human nature to track seizures long term. So we did a long prospective observational study called the Human Epilepsy Project, and everybody was given a very simple electronic diary, which reminded them every day to track. And we also asked them to write when they didn't have a seizure, no seizures today, so we can tell when they were not tracking versus when they were seizure-free, so to speak. And you can see from this figure here that the very small minority were consistently tracking over time, and we're talking about 36 months of time. There were some people who started out really well, and then the green is tracking and the red is not tracking, and you can see they just fizzled out and didn't continue tracking over time. There were some people who just tracked on and off throughout their course, and then there was the vast majority of people who hardly ever tracked a little better in the beginning, but really did not track very well at all. So this is the reality, that we really can't get a perspective from people's diaries most of the time. And wearables may be used to improve tracking, and many wearable devices provide a dashboard that displays events detected by the patient and the device, and the patient can then review it and remove ones that may have been false positive pushes. Now, the next important point we're going to talk about, and is talked about quite a bit in regards to devices, is can they reduce the risk of SUDEP, sudden unexplained death in epilepsy? And there is evidence that suggests that direct or indirect supervision can reduce SUDEP risk, and also that nocturnal supervision, and we already talked about tonic-clonic seizures at night, that nocturnal supervision was associated with a reduced risk of SUDEP. So the rationale of using a device to reduce the SUDEP risk is that most SUDEP, not all, but most, occurs following a seizure. Sorry about that. Most of it occurs at night, and the patient is found prone in bed. So hopefully, if somebody came in and just turned them over, that might help. So to call somebody to the bedside in the middle of the night to reposition or provide first aid may prevent some SUDEP. And importantly, even if there was nobody to come rushing to the bedside, just knowing that nocturnal tonic-clonic seizures are happening, again, almost half the time people don't know when they're happening, may increase physicians' ability to manage those tonic-clonic seizures, increase medication, change medication as necessary, because an ounce of prevention, of course, is worth a pound of cure. So how do wearable devices work? There are sensors. Those sensors, when they have detected a seizure, will then be sent to a transmitter. The transmitter can make an audible alarm so that other people around can hear that a seizure is happening. Most of these devices also can then send an alert to a family member or somebody else to indicate that a seizure is happening. I just recently heard about a situation where a young man was living in a dorm, and the people at the front desk of the dorm, he was in a single room in a dorm, and the people at the front desk were the ones that got the alert, and they would run up whenever he had a tonic-clonic seizure and make sure he was okay. This allowed him to live in the dorm when the family otherwise would not have felt comfortable with him being there. It can go to some sort of help desk, maybe 911, and perhaps it could ultimately also lead to intervention. So my poll question is, have you ever offered a wrist-worn seizure detection device to a patient, or offered an implanted seizure detection device to a patient? And it looks like actually many people have offered a wrist-worn seizure device, when far fewer, but actually still a third have who answered, and I presume it's the clinicians that answered, offered an implanted seizure device. Now, of course, this is a biased poll because we don't know who's answering, and it's only 37 out of the over 100 people who are on, so we'll have to talk about that later. So I said that there were sensors that picked up physiological changes, and that's what was used in an algorithm in order to determine whether somebody is having a seizure or not. I highly recommend this paper, this beautiful paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on devices. And this figure is right from that paper, and what it will tell you here is that there are many different types of physiological signals, including heart rate, EEG, muscle contraction, and so on, that can be used, and different devices, and I'll go into this a little bit, use different ones of those physiologic signals in their algorithm. The wearable device can be an armband or a wristband, a wristwatch, or some other types of device we'll talk about, and that is how the signal is created. Now, what do those wearables detect? They are much better at detecting tonic-clonic seizures. So you can detect a tonic-clonic seizure or a hemiclonic seizure with motion detection, muscle contraction, EEG, skin conductance, heart rate, audio, or a combination of the above. Unfortunately, the more common seizures, actually, the non-convulsive seizures, which are absence seizures, atypical absences, focal aware, focal impaired aware, myoclonic seizures, that is more complicated. You can sometimes pick those up with an EEG, I would say the majority of the time. You can sometimes pick them up with audio. You can sometimes pick them up with skin conductance, but it's far more complicated to pick up a seizure that is non-convulsive than a convulsive seizure. And that's why most of our devices right now are focused on picking up convulsive seizures. So the bottom line is that convulsive seizures are easy and reliable to detect, and other seizures are definitely more difficult, and detection will be variable. Now we're going to talk about some of the devices that are available for people in 2025. So I've limited this to talking about ones that you could actually ask for right now. So the first one is the Epimonitor, and that is the latest name for the device that many people have known for quite a number of years, and the first one to come, wrist-worn device to be FDA approved on the market from Empatica. And this device is available in the US and Europe. It primarily detects and alerts for tonic-clonic seizures, and the sensitivity and specificity is more than 90%. What does it use for its algorithm? It's a multimodal algorithm, including skin conductance, actigraphy, heart rate, and temperature. And how would a person with epilepsy get a hold of this? Well, it does require a prescription, so it's only available by prescription. And the prescription, the device itself costs about $300, and then you need a monthly subscription on top of the $300 in order to continue using it. It can be, in some cases, covered by insurance, but in other cases, the families do incur the cost. The second device, which is just recently been FDA approved and has become available, is the EpiWatch, and this is an app-based system, and it uses the sensors that are already embedded into the Apple Watch, and it only works for the moment on an Apple Watch. It primarily detects and alerts for tonic-clonic seizures, again, sensitivity and specificity more than 90%, and it uses the Apple Watch's accelerometer, gyroscope, and heart rate monitor for its algorithm. Again, it's only available by prescription, and it costs about $20 per month, but as long as you have the Apple Watch already, You don't need to buy any watch or device in order to have this. And of course, you could buy an Apple Watch for used Apple Watch, I presume, for not that much money. And then finally, the last one that has recently become FDA approved is the Night Watch Plus, has been available in Europe as well. It primarily detects and alerts for tonic-clonic, tonic, hyperkinetic, and myoclonic cluster seizures. So that is a larger scope of seizures that it detects because it does use accelerometry and body position in addition to heart rate. It has a sensitivity and specificity for over 90%. Right now, it is only available in Europe, but it is coming to the US. And as the name implies, it's only meant to be used at night and not during the day. And then there are some other systems that are detachable, and they include the systems that use EEG. So the first one is the REMI system, which was created by Epitel. And as you can see in the picture, there's a small disc that contains 2 electrodes and an amplifier, all in that little disc. And that can be placed in multiple locations on the head and in any number. So you can put little chiclets on one side, on both sides, wherever you want to on the, obviously under the hairline would be the best because it would be, then would not be detectable, but on the other hand, might not do as well as in some other locations. It's currently only approved in the US and only approved for hospital-based and ambulatory monitoring, which means it's not approved for any long-term use. It is reimbursed by some insurances for those purposes. It can detect tonic-clonic seizures, but also absence and focal seizures with variable sensitivity and specificity. And the other important thing to know about it is that it doesn't alert as of now. In the future, it may, but right now it captures information, and that information can then be reviewed by a physician or a reading person. And then the next one is EpiHunter. It was available in Europe, is temporarily off the market, but presumably will come back. It was created by a father with a child with absence seizures, and it detects, logs, and signals absence seizures by EEG in real time. And so that means that it can show the other people in the, who can see the device, visually see it, that the child is having an absence at any particular time, which can be useful in a classroom to say this child is not going to be able to absorb any material at this particular point, or may be helpful with friends who know, okay, now take a tick. This child is not going to be able to pay attention right now. But it also can be worn under a baseball cap so that it is less visible and then can be read afterwards. And recently, we have had an introduction in the market also of long-term minimally invasive EEG technology. These devices are implanted subscalp, and they are continuously there, obviously, and provide continuous EEG signal, albeit over limited scalp areas. So UN EEG is currently only available in Europe, and Epiminder is currently available in Europe and soon in the US. It's currently only approved for ambulatory monitoring, not approved for long-term use. So it's mostly used for detection of seizures, not alerting for seizures, which would be a long-term use. But again, these things are quickly evolving over time. It can detect, obviously, tonic-clonic seizures, but it can also detect absence focal seizures with various sensitivity and specificity. And again, you can build up days to weeks to months of information, which then can be reviewed afterwards. Now, in the future, these long-term EEG devices have the potential not only for seizure detection, but also for seizure forecasting, which is very exciting, to tell somebody that a seizure is imminent. Because many of you may be aware of the wonderful work that's been done on multi-DN cycling and also diurnal cycling, saying that seizures and epileptic activity occurs in reproducible cycles that are based on either the time of day or may occur, again, multi-DN over many days. And what this little picture shows from a wonderful paper by Maxim Baud and colleagues is that, what you're seeing going up and down here is epileptic interictal activity. And these little red dots are when the seizures happen. And you can see that the interictal activity is rising, telling you that a seizure is likely imminent or several seizures. So that rising phase can be detected and people can be alerted. This is potentially a high risk time for you. And the other lovely thing to see is when that interictal activity is at its nadir, basically no seizures ever happen. So there may be the possibility of telling people not only a seizure might happen, but also you're safe, you can go do whatever you want. A seizure is very unlikely to happen now. Now, I don't want you to walk away thinking that everything is rosy and that these devices are going to solve all our problems. We did ask people through a survey of the Epilepsy Foundation, and quite a number of people answered the surveys. What issues or concerns do you have using these devices? And as you can see, the very biggest concern that people had was for false alarms, alerting for a seizure when there isn't actually a seizure. And false alarms can be a problem, or they can be not a problem. There are several studies with several devices that show that many of the false alarms come from just a small subset of people, and then other people may never have a false alarm. So it's useful to know whether a particular person is going to have a lot of false alarms or not. False alarms are more common during the day than they are at night. So, a seizure usually is a seizure if it's picked up at night, but we'll learn more about how to deal with false alarms as time goes by. But there are other concerns as well, such as dropped pairing with the iPhone or the device, failure to detect a seizure, which you can see did not happen infrequently, the stigma attached to using a device, and several other things. And of course, cost is a huge concern for a lot of people. So we have to have these devices getting better and better, and we have to make sure that we understand who it's going to be good for and what it's going to be good for. So when you bring all of this information together, the question is, what can wearable devices do to improve management of people with epilepsy? So for children and adults with tonic-clonic seizures, certainly there are devices available right now that are able to detect and potentially bring aid quickly, and also may be useful to determine if there are missed tonic-clonic seizures, especially at night. And I just want to remind everybody, there's no reason that the alerting has to be turned on. It can be turned off so that you don't have to be bothered by false positives if that's a concern. And for children and adults with nocturnal tonic-clonic seizures and hyperkinetic seizures, devices can alert and also track how often this is happening. How about SUDEP prevention? It could be that having an alerting device may be like someone in the room. In some cases, we know that terminal cascades may be irreversible. People have died of SUDEP in the hospital with medical aid available, and it has failed to prevent SUDEP. But it may be that just bringing a parent into the room and having them shake a child or turn an adult over could be useful. There was recently a case on social media where the next door neighbor was the one that got the alerts and came running over, was able to call 911, and 911 was able to talk her through giving CPR and saved the life of the individual. So certainly we know that it can prevent SUDEP. We just don't know in what % of cases. Obviously, caregivers need to be nearby to deliver the intervention. It was a great idea to give it to the next door neighbor, rather than a parent that might not be nearby or might be in another city even. And what about people who live alone without available caregivers? What are their options? For non-convulsive or combination convulsive and non-convulsive, we're going to have to rely probably on subscalp devices. And those, this thing has a life of its own. Those could potentially determine if events of unclear etiology are epileptic in nature, determine if a person is aware of all their seizures, and if not, what the seizure frequency is, and confirm seizure freedom after anti-seizure medicine discontinuation. And of course, the exciting future of wearables might be forecasting to allow for use of rescue medications at times of high risk, and combination devices that have a higher sensitivity and specificity with lower false alarm rate, better, more personalized algorithms, availability of simple devices worldwide, even in resource-poor settings, and combination of wearables with electronic seizure diaries. So the food for thought for you is, should everyone with epilepsy have some sort of wearable so that they at least will know about tonic-clonic seizures, or, determine whether there are unwitnessed tonic-clonic seizures. And with that, I will turn it back.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks for that fabulous overview. And we'll perhaps have time for some questions at the end. But next, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Arjune Sen, who's Professor of Global Epilepsy in Oxford in the UK. And he's going to talk about apps for a more holistic management of global epilepsy. Thank you, Arjune.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the ILAE for organising this very interesting webinar on digital technologies. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is with us online. So try and just move the screen down. So what I'm going to be talking about over the next 20 minutes or so is apps for a more holistic management of global epilepsy. And we're going to talk about holistic equity, vulnerability, certain limitations, the place for small data in a world of big data, and certain other perspectives as well. So I thought I'd start with a poll as well. So to ask all of the audience what you feel the main barriers are to good epilepsy care in low and middle income countries. So is it that there are not enough people seeking care? Is it that there are not enough clinicians, not enough diagnostic tools, not enough money, and not enough engagement? Now, I appreciate that many of those answers may be your preferred, but I'd encourage you to just choose one, what you think the most important barrier is to good epilepsy care. I'll give you a few seconds for that. So not enough people seeking care, not enough clinicians, not enough diagnostic tools, not enough money, not enough engagement. So quite a spectrum, but a quarter thinking about not enough clinicians, about a fifth saying not enough money, and then smaller percentages for not enough tools, engagement, not enough people seeking care. So let's move on and then see what the talk may reveal. So if we look at holistic care, well, what is holistic? So holistic means care that is characterized by the treatment of the whole person, taking into account mental and social factors rather than just the symptoms of an illness. And as you will know, epilepsy is an exemplar condition for that because of its interconnectedness with multiple aspects across cognitive health, psychological health, and psychosocial well-being. But we also live in a very inequitable world. So this was the photo of Time magazine. This is from a website called Unequal Scenes, and this is a highway in South Africa, in Johannesburg, showing the clear divide across that highway. But that plays out not just in South Africa. This is a photo from Durban, which is where my wife's family are from. This is taken in the Philippines. This is taken in Mumbai. So we live in a very inequitable world. And that inequity plays out in all communities. So this is a photo actually taken in Baltimore in the United States. And you can see the very affluent flats on one side of the street and the dilapidated building immediately opposite those affluent flats. So what we're going to do a little bit is explore inequity and data inequity through the lens of epilepsy. And we are all aware that epilepsy is a condition of the more marginalized. It is more common in low to middle income countries. 80 to 85% of people with epilepsy live in those settings. Even in high income countries, it's more common in lower socioeconomic groups. It's a condition that affects people across their life course. It associates with marginalized conditions such as intellectual disability, ADHD, and autism, and thereby can affect people who are less able to advocate for themselves in communities who are already marginalized. And unfortunately, this disparity is only going to increase. We recognize after the COVID-19 pandemic how inequity is actually sharpened worldwide. And more than that, epilepsy is a condition that becomes more common as we get older. Populations are aging very quickly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and you could argue that populations in Western Europe, the US, Canada, and the UK are aged. There will still be some aging, but aging is happening very quickly in certain parts of the world. And thereby, epilepsy will become more common in those communities which may have less infrastructure to cope with that increased burden of epilepsy. To put that into context, by 2100 in India, there will be 36.1% of the population will be over the age of 60. Remembering that India already is a population of around 1.2 billion people, that is at least 400,000 people aged over 60 by 2100. Epilepsy is a condition that becomes more common as we get older, but it's not, again, equitable in that. Certain populations are more affected by epilepsy as they get older, particularly as is shown here in a very nice paper now from some time ago, demonstrating that epilepsy is most common in the Black male population. Thereby, epilepsy is a true public health imperative, and it is upon all of us to try and ensure that we can drive equitable change, and digital technologies may offer us one lever in which to drive that change more effectively. And so what we're looking for is to create true equity. So equality, as many people on this call will be familiar, is giving everyone the same. But what you need is equity so that everyone has the same opportunity, so everyone can see over the fence. We all know, though, that this is reality, and perhaps at an absolute utopian level, what we're looking for is liberation, so that there is no fence at all. I often am struck when I show this slide that it's great that the fence has gone, but I'm really uncertain as to why the gentleman has also been liberated of his trousers, and I have no clear answer for that. So that's what we're looking for. But there are many, many barriers to that, particularly in epilepsy. So one is stigma. Epilepsy has been very stigmatized throughout time. Ancient beliefs such as possession, lunacy, that epilepsy is a result of retribution, or that it may be contagious. And this is an example of someone describing their seizures. This is from Kenya. So 48-year-old female described her seizures as, when I fall down, those people are aware, like yourself. When I have fallen, you will see me. But for me, when I fall down, I see a figure, not a person like you or me. It's the devil, that one. You see him clearly. So in the first paragraph, she's describing the fall that could occur in a seizure. But the second paragraph, particularly in communities that may be less sensitized or less aware of epilepsy, you can see how that description might be very difficult and very stigmatizing. We're aware that across multiple communities, people will seek help from traditional healthcare practitioners, traditional healers, faith healers, rather than coming to, in inverted commas, more conventional medicine. That can also associate with certain stigmatization. The emergency resuscitation poster is from a case in Oxford where a woman who was a very diligent worker in an office had a seizure at work. The colleagues were not particularly supportive beforehand after she had been in hospital and she had returned to work after some convalescence. They put posters like this all over the offices, and everyone knew that it had been her that had been off from work. So although in the guise of being helpful to offer basic life support, if someone had a collapse, this was actually further stigmatizing. The second problem, as we've already alluded to, as was alluded to in the poll, is infrastructure. So there are not enough clinicians. So this is a photo taken in the UK at the Association of British Neurologists meeting, and it's but maybe a half of the number of neurologists that were in the UK at that time, maybe even a third. And at the same time, that same year, this is the number of neurologists that were in Zimbabwe. And as you can see, I'm one of the people in the photo. And as you'll appreciate, that means that if I leave, the number of neurologists halves to just gift. And if I arrive, then the number of neurologists doubles. There has been some improvement with time, but you can see that there's inordinate inequity in terms of infrastructure. But it's more nuanced than you think. So the Google map shows all of the neurology clinics that are within what Google Maps can show of Saks Fifth Avenue. But in the US, for example, if you look at how many epilepsy specialists there are in Arizona, or in Montana, or in Vermont, or in Wyoming, so there is inequity everywhere. So how do we solve these problems? So there is a need for data-driven apps in low to middle income countries. I would also argue in marginalized communities in high income countries, epilepsy is common. There are not enough clinicians to meet need, and that's primary healthcare workers, epilepsy specialist nurses, as well as epileptologists. And crucially, it's a treatable condition. It also affects vulnerable populations disproportionately, and that's something we must bear in mind as we develop the technologies. And so what we're really looking for when we talk about equity is this photo. So this is Usain Bolt at the 2018 Beijing Olympics. And the reason I show this photo is that Usain, because of course we're on first name terms, wasn't going to run the 100 meters at all. He was a 200-meter specialist. So he had to persuade his coach to enable him to run the 100 meters to allow this photograph. And that's what we're all looking for, is equity of opportunity. And apps may offer us one way to achieve that. So this is an app that we developed with multiple partners in sub-Saharan Africa. You take a large data set, so a data set of 5,000 individuals with active convulsive epilepsy, and you do a traditional model. So you develop a model, you have a holdout test set, exactly as Colin was saying in the first talk. You then test it against that, and then you do an external validation. And we identified that there are 8 critical questions that you can put into a logistic regression model, and you get a very good area under the curve. So the model is then both sensitive and specific, both in the holdout test set and in the external validation set. And I always add this because Gabriel Jones, who led a lot of this work here in Oxford, then won the poster at like the first AI conference on epilepsy and neurological disorders. And it just shows that actually winning poster prizes and presenting posters is really important. The next step analysis of that work showed that you need to do more, because actually, if you look at the app and the model in terms of the internal data set and external data sets and compare across sites, these are the sites that contributed the data, you would expect the model to do really well on the internal data set if you're testing the model against its internal data. And generally it did, but not universally. And this shows that you need a lot of data and you need to look at improving these apps iteratively. We've put all of this data into an app. So this is the Epilepsy Diagnostic Companion, and this is now being used as a screening tool. You can put it on a tablet, you can translate it into multiple languages. This is someone using the tool to go through those questions and try, and eventually the app gives you whether you need to refer someone to for an epileptology opinion, or whether it needs to go back to primary care. And it can streamline the process. So when you don't have enough clinicians, you want those clinicians to be seeing the people they really need to see. This is the number of assessments that have been done roughly, and the app is now being rolled out for further data collection in new sites. It's for the latest site that it's going to be rolled out in is Nepal, and that work will be starting in mid-December. So what about EEG? Well, EEG, to my mind, has always seemed the optimal thing to apply AI to because it's a waveform, and waveform is essentially mathematics. And again, Colin alluded to this. This is work by Professor Beninsky and his group in Denmark about trying to bring low-cost EEG to bridge diagnostic gaps in low-resource settings. This is, again, a photo from Sandor, and this is his app about how you apply the headset and actually ensure that the headset is being applied correctly, you're getting a good reading, and then you can run the EEG. And you can then put in an algorithm to read the EEG, and this was the curve that you saw before about how that algorithm is good at being able to capture epileptiform discharges. And it's important you do this collaboratively. So this is work that we're doing on developing a headset. This is taking it, and you have to get out into the field. You have to go to the communities where actually there is the most need. This is a photo taken about 15 miles from the Mozambique border in Zimbabwe with our engineering team, and Tara Kaziti, who works with the Epilepsy Support Foundation in Zimbabwe. That's Taurai applying the headset. So this is a headset that can be applied by primary healthcare workers or others with some upskilling in how to put it on. And then you can see in the second photo that it's connected at the moment to the laptop, which has an algorithm to read the EEG. Eventually, this will connect through by Bluetooth, but a lot of work needs to be done. You also see in this photo the effects of epilepsy. You can see that the gentleman who's wearing the EEG has burns on both legs, quite severe burns on his left leg. If we can get the diagnostic tools to people earlier and then get treatment in place, perhaps we can prevent these kinds of injuries. So the pathway in terms of diagnostics is you have a possible seizure, you need to obtain a history, and then you do appropriate investigation. So how can we digitize that? Well, you could capture the history in an app with appropriate binary questions. You can take a video. Now, smartphones are very common. You could do an EEG. That can be done even in remote settings. And you can create an integrated diagnostic platform, and then you can put AI across all of these areas. So what about the holistic part? Because epilepsy is far more than seizures alone. So, and we're very interested in looking at the interconnectedness between epilepsy, stroke, and dementia, for example. So if you're going to look at cognition in people with epilepsy and make that scalable, you need apps that don't rely on language, and there's no practice effect. So with this tool, this is part of a suite of apps. You show someone on a tablet 2 different fractals, and then the screen goes blank, and then you have to identify which fractal you saw before, and most can do that. And then you have to drag it to where you saw it on the screen, a what was where test. But people may be less good if there are problems with hippocampal binding at remembering where they saw the fractal. And these tests can become more complex, so you could put 3 fractals up initially, and then you have to identify which one of the 3 you saw, and so on and so forth. But it's language agnostic, and also there's no practice effect. So these are how you can get insights into cognitive difficulties in epilepsy at scale. But what about diagnosis? You need a treatment option. So you always will need a treatment. And again, AI may have a role there. This is not from epilepsy. This is taken from a psychiatry group here who are looking at network meta-analyses and other ways of trying to predict what might be the best antidepressant for someone with a given constellation of symptoms. And again, exactly as was alluded to, now we have the data sets and the computational power to try and do that. So you can take some of the error out of choosing what may be an appropriate treatment. You also, though, need to ensure there's equitable medicines access. So this is a program that I'm very pleased about because it only started 5 days ago to develop AI-related equitable medicines access, so a tablet-to-tablet model, if you will. But what is treatment without care? And we necessarily don't want care like this. We want care to remain like this. And so we do need humans in the loop for sure. And we need to, with all of this AI and all of this technology, make sure we have cultural specific understanding. So this is where small data can fit in. And you'll remember the slide on stigma and how someone described their seizures. So this is a tool that was created for someone who had, for middle-aged Black females who had not completed high school, and it was designed to improve medication adherence. This is a quote. Speaker described a study, the ideas behind it, methods, results, typical participant, and then they found that the app didn't really work. And the speaker said that's the fault, in inverted commas, might actually be with the participants. But there's a problem in that because, of course, the fault isn't with the participants. Whether someone adheres to a medication is not a binary yes, no. You have to take into consider that person, their lived experience and their context and what it is that might be contributing to them not taking their medication. So that quote is from Faye Cobb-Patton, who's shown here with me at a meeting on equitable AI. And her points are really that you can design an algorithm. It can be specific for marginalized groups. You can be trying to do good, but without lived experience, without understanding, without contextualization, it's not going to embed, it's not going to be feasible, and the very people you thought you were helping might be pushed further behind. So what do we do now? Well, I would argue that big data plus small data equals great data. So that's where you can really make the difference. Everyone on this call has their own lived experience. Everyone has their own expertise, and we have to harness that together to try and drive equitable healthcare. We have to avoid silos. We cannot practice medicine like this. Epilepsy is a great exemplar condition for demonstrating that you will not be able to solve it by working in ivory towers or small units. You have to work collaboratively. So what we really want to think about is how can we pull together? Let's say, for example, you have a rock and you want to move the rock. So you could try and push the rock, but if you want to try and move that rock a bit better, you might put a rope on the rock. If you really wanted to move the rock, you might want lots of ropes on the rock, but it will only work if the ropes are all pulling in the same direction. If the ropes are pulling in different directions, you might have been better off just pushing the rock yourself without a rope. So how can we move to pull together, not pull apart? So bearing all of that in mind, we'll come to the final audience poll, which, as you'll see, is exactly the same as the start. So do we still think, or what do we think? Do we think that the main barriers to good epilepsy care are that there are not enough people seeking care, not enough clinicians, not enough diagnostic tools, not enough money, or is it that we don't have enough engagement? So not enough people seeking care, not enough clinicians, not enough tools, not enough money, not enough engagement. And so there has been a shift, and I would agree with that. So I very much agree that there aren't enough clinicians. That is definitely true. There isn't enough money. That is also true, and that applies across all settings. We can create the tools. We know there are lots of people who need the care, but the key driver, the absolute key driver, is that we need engagement, and we need engagement across all stakeholders. And to put that in context and to go back to Usain, so this is Usain now, 8 years later, Rio 2016. As you can see, there's a certain degree of, familiarity, shall we say, that has crept in by this stage. But you can do this test on the New York Times as to whether you can beat Usain Bolt out of the blocks. And look, you can. So this is only one test of reaction time. It's not saying that I'm faster than Usain Bolt, but you can do it as long as you want to do it. And so with that in mind, we've stated the problem, and restating the problem will not create a solution. We have to start and we have to work together to do it. One thing that we have done in collaboration with the ILAE, with the IBE and multiple partners is create the Centre for Global Epilepsy, which works across multiple countries and is trying to make sure that those ropes really align in global epilepsy together and develop culturally contextualized tools at scale. So with that, I will conclude. And so remember, collaboration and contextualization is always key. And I think it's good to end with Taylor Swift quotes. So this is from like the real back catalogue. So this is from Evermore and a song called Marjorie. And she said in the song, "Never be so kind you forget to be clever. Never be so clever you forget to be kind. Never be so polite you forget your power. Never wield such power you forget to be polite." So obviously what she meant by this is never be so deferential that you don't think that there are opportunities. There are opportunities. Never develop an AI algorithm and be so clever that you forget the people you're trying to serve. Never be so polite and so quiet that you forget where the need is and the communities that need the help that AI and digital tech can offer. But never wield such power with the AI and the digital tech that you lose sight of who you are actually trying to help in the process. So in conclusion, holistic care is vital, especially in the digital age. The difficulties we've highlighted apply to many disorders in many settings, but the opportunities also apply in many settings, including marginalized communities in high-income countries. Equity, partnership is crucial, and all AI, all digital technology is going to need to be grounded in patient need and be deliverable by clinical teams working together. And this is part of the Oxford Global Epilepsy team at a meeting here a couple of years ago. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Arjune. Thank you to all our speakers. We do have a few minutes open for questions and answers. And in fact, I'm going to, so if I can ask all the speakers to put on their video cameras again. We have had some questions in the Q&A, but I think, first of all, because some of them I think would be answered by something, Jackie, that I think I'm going to put to you, which is, where are we currently with devices on the market? Are they fit for purpose? What are the barriers to us using them?
So they're fit for some purpose, but not all purpose. So I think that the biggest barrier is the lack of easy devices to detect anything other than tonic-clonic seizures. I mean, tonic-clonic seizures are definitely our most problematic seizure type for many people, one that everybody pays attention to and can be deadly. So having devices that detect that, I think, is very, very, very important and very useful. But again, you know, everybody has to think when they present a device to an individual, first of all, we have to get more clinicians thinking about devices. But, you know, then when you present to the person with epilepsy, you know, you have to figure out how they are going to use it for what purpose and whether it's going to actually benefit them. So, for example, you know, as I mentioned before, somebody living alone who has nobody for the signal to go out to might not help all that much, right? A parent with a child who has, you know, status epilepticus in the middle of the night that's not tonic-clonic and doesn't have a lot of motion involved might not help very much, right? They may want to use, you know, there are some non-FDA approved devices like the SAMI that just are basically baby cameras that will notify when there's a lot of just unusual movement in the bed. And they may want to consider that. So, you know, you have to go through as the clinician and figure out, is there a good purpose at this point for using it? And is it going to help this person? And then, you know, try it out and see how it goes. But I think that over time, we're going to get better and the devices are going to get better.
And I suppose the other comment is that they may get cheaper, I suppose, because that's one of the issues in lower and middle income countries. So then to extend that, and there's one question about, surely, you know, and there was a question, I think, Colin, you put up at the end about whether we're worried about being replaced. Thankfully, not many people thought that we were going to be replaced. But I mean, because epilepsy diagnosis is still a clinical diagnosis, still needs somebody trained to make that diagnosis. Although, and I know Arjune, but others may want to comment, apps may help.
No, thank you. Yeah, so I think that's exactly it, that apps may help so they can streamline the process. And I think that it's the case that doctors who utilize AI are going to replace doctors who don't utilize AI, but AI is not going to replace doctors because it is a very nuanced diagnosis. The large and especially non-convulsive epilepsy can be very difficult to diagnose, and it's culturally appropriate. The way someone describes a seizure, even in the UK compared to the US, let alone in Zambia compared to India, might be very, very different. And so we need that cultural contextualization. But maybe the apps, what they can do is better streamline the process and offer some initial triage steps to try and help in that pathway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So maybe then, yeah, sorry, Colin, I'm
I was
also
just
going
going
to
to
add
concur
to your...
that. Yeah, go ahead.
Go
Yep.
ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was actually going to come to you because one of the questions is, when do you define a technology as a digital technology? But then because we're coming to the end, give you an opportunity to say where next, where are we going next? What should we do next, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I would consider this to be digital in the sense that we don't really analyze analog recordings here. So, I mean, most of this is recorded as digital. So, yeah, I would certainly consider that to be that aspect. I mean, I agree. So what's next? And I think that kind of leads on from what Arjune was saying as well, is that, what we found within, at least with the African community for engagement there was, yes, there is that feel even amongst patients. And maybe that's a testament to us as how good we are as clinicians, that they had faith in us. And the faith in us was much greater than the faith in the technology. So they even said that it would be very unsatisfactory to not have a human in the loop to interpret this and to discuss this with them. So that was very critical there. Yeah, so I think the next steps that we're hoping to engage is that we are performing now a scoping review to start to understand the needs and priorities for people with epilepsy. That's going to be on behalf of the ILAE and the IBE. And then the next steps beyond that as well is that we have great excitement from the IBE as well. There's going to be plans within the new year of producing focus groups and questionnaires amongst people around the world, stratified by different regions and different countries to start to understand what are local needs within that region. Because I do think that at a very global level, we need to start to understand where those priorities are and how we can start to address the highest needs. Because again, if we're thinking about risks and if we're thinking about climate impact and so on and so forth, there needs to be a lot of attention paid to these algorithms to ensure that they're reliable, to ensure that they're effective, and ensure that they're not going to result in climate catastrophes. So some of that comes down to just rather than making a ton of AI solutions and trying to force them on people, it's more about listening to what is exactly needed and only producing what is needed. And so that's going to be one of our exciting initiatives over the next year, is going to be engaging with clinicians, engaging with allied health professionals, but also having strong collaborations with the IBE to start to understand at a patient and caregiver level what is needed there as well. So hopefully we can all start to work together as a collaborative global community to really define what is needed and how to achieve those goals.
Thank you. Thank you. As we're coming to the end of the hour and a half, so thank you to all our speakers for fabulous talks. I think they've been well appreciated, looking at the questions that have been put, comments that have been put in. As a reminder, you'll be asked to complete a short survey that will pop up when you leave the eForum, and this will really inform us about where we go next, hopefully with future eFora. And tomorrow you will also receive an email with details on how to access the self-paced virtual case from the Academy to consolidate the learnings. Keep an eye on all the ILAE social media pages and our website to learn more about other educational events. Our next eForum is on EEG, when, why, and how, and will be on the 12th of December. So please register for that. This particular eForum will be available on demand in approximately 1 week.